Okay, well, welcome everyone to this is the penultimate webinar in the Sustainability Politics seminar series. We're very lucky to have here today with us Eva Giraud from the University of Sheffield. Eva will be speaking on ethical enrollment and exclusion in digital food systems. So looking at questions of veganism and the mainstreaming of veganism. And there'll be a 20 to 30 minute talk followed by plenty of time for Q&A. So over to you, Eva.
Thanks, I'll just get my slides up. One thing I wanted to say about the, One thing I wanted to say about the abstract was that originally it had been for a journal with quite prescriptive. I sort of sent it on and then read it back and realised it's got a particular tone to it, and that is because it was originally for a journal which had a very sort of prescriptive format for abstracts. So hopefully this talk will be a little bit more nuanced than the actual abstract itself. Anyway, it's called Is It Vegan? And really the structure of the talk is going to start by just providing a bit of context about veganism's mainstreaming and popularization, and then how it's become kind of enmeshed in certain controversies at the same time as many legitimate criticisms are being leveled at it. I'm then going to kind of situate some of this in relation to my previous work. And then the main thing I wanted to talk about is really some interview data that, to be honest, is still a kind of work in progress. I'm still working out what to do with those materials that sort of speak to this point about the relationship between veganism's popularization and the quite specific role of digital media in that process. So last week, and this is going to reveal something horrible and embarrassing about my television habit, so sorry in advance, but like last week I was watching The Apprentice, and one of the I know I feel ashamed, but one of the candidates on The Apprentice essentially said they were kind of pitching a business to sell secondhand clothing or pre-loved clothing as it was branded, and to sort of justify why it would be a kind of good business proposal, this candidate sort of said, well, you know, it's going to be the new veganism. And I just thought that was a really interesting sort of framing of something, that this practice that was for kind of years really quite marginal. You know, it was a lot of people didn't even know really what veganism was or meant, has suddenly about 5 years ago really it kind of exploded into the mainstream, so that now almost every menu has got a plant-based option, and it's seen as the kind of new thing, so much so that other business proposals are kind of contrasted against it in comparison with its lucrativeness. And I think this is kind of reflected in these very kind of popular cultural depictions of veganism, from vegan influencers to BBC television programmes hosted by sort of ex-frontmen of the Dirty Sanchez collective. There's been this kind of really quite kind of new framing of veganism that's emerged in recent years, that's quite removed from stereotypes associated with it 10, 20 years ago. And I think this kind of the status of veganism perhaps reached its peak a few years ago, when it was seen as having such a cultural cachet that Piers Morgan spat out a Greggs sausage roll live on television on Good Morning Britain, which was kind of enrolled in a very particular culture wars narrative, as I'll talk about shortly as well. But alongside this popularization of veganism, there obviously have been very particular sustainability narratives about why kind of transitions to plant-based diets maybe are important from that perspective. So probably the most famous report was the kind of Eat Lancet report from, I think it was 2019, which was very much framed as dietary change being the kind of biggest lever for sustainability that could happen. And it was kind of really pushing for transitions to plant-based diets. And obviously the very specific ways in which veganism is popularized both run alongside these kind of links with veganism and sustainability, but also have quite an uneasy relationship with narratives of sustainability too, because obviously many of the ways in which it's being popularized and the outlets through which it's being popularized don't necessarily map that neatly onto a sustainability agenda for various reasons. And these dynamics, these kind of cultural discourses, have led to some quite kind of prominent critiques of veganism, but also of kind of lifestyle activism more broadly, intersecting in quite kind of specific ways. So on the one hand, there's this kind of culture wars narrative where veganism is sort of held up as a practice engaged in by a kind of snowflake generation who are kind of overly committed to sort of political correctness. And I think that's why someone like Piers Morgan sort of spits out the Greg sausage roll. I'm doing a kind of another project at the moment about online hate speech, and Greg sausage roll was actually a kind of trending keyword because it was seen as a sort of emblem of kind of political correctness, etc., which is kind of interesting. But alongside this critique is a kind of far more, I suppose, nuanced and, from my perspective, important critique that's coming from a social justice perspective and raising some quite kind of important criticisms of lifestyle activism. Sorry, the comparison with, I've realised I've skipped over something. The culture wars narrative is quite similar, works in a similar way to narratives about popular feminism, where it's a kind of point where feminist narratives of empowerment are kind of very, very visible, but also very much entangled with popular misogyny and in quite a kind of complex dialogue with that. And I think there's something similar going on between kind of the prominence and popularity of veganism and kind of reactive critiques of it. However, there are these more, I think, important criticisms of lifestyle activism or lifestyle movements, as Hayne Flare Jones and Johnson point out, that are occurring at the same time, where people are raising these quite kind of important criticisms of practices that focus on, I suppose, individual changes to lifestyle as a kind of route into more sustainable futures, because of the various inequities that can shape who can and can't engage in certain ethical practices, and who might be kind of even harmed if certain practices are sort of mainstreamed without considering their consequences. So as a kind of reflection of these sorts of critiques, there's a tradition in kind of feminist science and technology studies in particular that's pointed out or been quite critical of veganism as a sort of specific example of lifestyle movements. Such as Donna Haraway, for instance, suggests that, you know, considering the fact that any way of living involves killing, there's no kind of innocent position, and veganism is kind of included in that. Elspeth Probyn takes things a step further, suggesting that increasingly the choice to proclaim oneself vegan seems to act as an opting out of the structural complexities of food provisioning, production and consumption. And Alexis Shotwell takes a kind of, I suppose, more nuanced position in terms of situating veganism as part of a kind of wider critique, again, of initiatives that focus on individual practice as a site of change. As Shotwell puts here, if we hold ethics to the level of the individual, we restrict ethical choice to those who are most privileged by and within the system. Now, one of the things that I kind of felt uneasy about, when I think these are really important critiques, but I felt increasingly uneasy about them for a couple of reasons in my own work. So firstly, in a kind of methodological sense, in these texts as a whole, there are a lot of kind of empirical claims that are being made about movements like veganism, which are held up as sort of individualistic forms of purity politics. But in light of the fact these are quite sociological claims, there wasn't very much sociological research about the lifestyle movements that were being criticised to really sort of evidence that they fitted the kind of understandings that were being imposed on them in these books. My second concern was the risk of these very important critiques of lifestyle activism inadvertently intersecting with a kind of culture wars wholesale critique of any form of sort of prefigurative political action. In other words, it kind of descends into a sort of more reactionary position inadvertently, that kind of idea of there being no form of ethical consumption under capitalism, translating into, well, we can't really do anything at all. You know, there's a kind of risk, or I was worried about a risk of that. And it's these types of concerns that I tried to address in my books. And I talk about kind of veganism in both books, but in slightly different ways. So the first book engaged in vegan activism it was looking at a case study that's now about, I suppose almost 20 years old now, certainly 15 years old, which was the use of veganism in anti-capitalist protest camps. And this was obviously a form of veganism pre-popularization, where it was used in quite experimental ways in contexts where activists were trying to sort of prefigure alternative worlds that were kind of designed along anti-capitalist ideals. And I was looking at protest camps as this kind of experimental site where these forms of prefigurative politics took place. And the kind of arguments I really made in the book were essentially trying to sort of trouble the notion of lifestyle movements as being a form of individualistic purity politics, by arguing that maybe if you actually look at how this form of activism is unfolded in practice, it's often a little bit more nuanced, reflective and collective than it's sometimes portrayed in high profile academic texts, or certainly the texts in the tradition I was looking at. And my kind of arguments in the book were really, firstly, that these forms of activism aren't necessarily a form of purity politics, but were often a route into complex questions about food system inequalities. So activists were trying to build their own kitchens, work with local kind of farmers and wholesalers to kind of create food systems that fitted with their ideals, that took into account animal ethics, but also kind of labour politics and environmental ethics. And there were a lot of tensions between those things that often had to be worked through. And this led to my second point, that often it was through actually building food infrastructures that people found ways of trying to make visible and be attentive to the different forms of inequalities that were bound up with food systems, and as a means of kind of experimenting with ways of negotiating those inequalities within the structures that they were, bringing into being. And obviously this was happening in a very small scale in protest camps, but I still sort of drew something hopeful from them, particularly in the way that they sort of maybe troubled certain narratives about lifestyle activism that were quite prominent at the time. However, and this is where things get more complicated, over the past 5 years, I think that many of the arguments I was making here have really changed quite significantly. And I think, again, the Greggs sausage roll is an almost like emblem of some of those shifts. Veganism is no longer this kind of fringe activist concern that's kind of engaged with in sites such as protest camps as part of experimental anti-capitalist politics. Today, it's so popular that it's held up as a trend on The Apprentice. And it's that kind of jumping off point that I deal with in my second book, Veganism, which I focus on in the final chapter in particular, which I call kind of post-veganism, the rise of plant-based capitalism, which was just trying to sort of sketch out really some of the recent trends in veganism. And in this piece, I was using sort of framework developed by Ros Gill's work on post-feminism, which kind of sketches out some of the recurring motifs and themes that characterize post-feminist media narratives. And I was sort of seeing if I could do something similar with trends in veganism. I was taking a kind of classic cultural studies approach, Birmingham School kind of cultural studies approach, really, where I was just assembling different media texts and narratives from marketers, etc., and piecing them together. But this was supplemented with a series of interviews with long-term vegans who were sort of vegan for 10 plus years. And one of the kind of things that was noted across all of the interviews and across the chapter really was that there was a lot of potential in veganism's popularization. It's kind of really interesting seeing this, I suppose, practice that seems to echo these institutionalized narratives about sustainability and transitions to plant-based food systems kind of becoming popularized in quite interesting ways. The risk, though, was that the way that veganism has become popularized seemed to focus on maximizing food choices within existing systems, while potentially undercutting scope to question or critique the more problematic aspects of those systems. And one of the kind of wider themes that I was that I sort of noted in the interviews in particular were some tensions that had emerged between the kind of newfound easiness of veganism and the potential to draw connections with wider political issues that had been a part of earlier forms of activist veganism. And these were reflected through loads of the interviews I did. So one of the kind of common refrains was people were really excited about veganism's popularization because it was just more convenient and accessible. People could kind of eat things that they couldn't before. There was also a recognition that maybe it was important to move beyond a kind of elitist or potentially elitist activist stance. As Scotty here says, it's all very well to say Tesco's, they're not very ethical, are they? Well, they might not be, but they're selling food half the price. And just to clarify here, when I say vegan 34,
Oh dear. Are you there, Eva?
yeah, I'm there again. Can you hear me now?
Sorry, what happened just then?
It just, Zoom just kicked me out for no, I don't know why, it just, Zoom just crashed. But
I'm so sorry.
no, it's probably my computer. Can you, shall I share my screen again? Would that work?
Yes, please do. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Hopefully. Okay. Basically, there were just concerns that these, the way that there were sort of fewer opportunities, partly because of popularization, to engage with wider ethical issues. So, for example, people mentioned things like, you know, they used to be able to have to search out these tiny vegan cafes or community centres that would also have things like anti-nuclear stickers, Huntsab stickers, you know, literature about Labour politics. And, you know, if you go to a cafe now or you go to a mainstream restaurant with an option, those potentials to make connections maybe aren't there in quite the same way. At the same time, again, people felt they'd rather have popularization than pathologization that existed previously. So now in the last kind of 5 minutes, I just wanted to talk about where digital media come into all of this in a more sustained way. So the role of media kind of echoes and is entwined with the trajectory of veganism itself. And actually this is a point I've seen Josh has come here. This is actually a comment Josh made after a talk I did a couple of years ago. So I want to say thanks for that. But where digital media come in is it sort of speaks to a kind of shift away from sort of DIY infrastructures where activists actually kind of create things themselves and kind of create, I suppose, create their own infrastructures, to things being, to using things that have been made by other people, if that makes sense. And I'm going to kind of clarify what I mean by that. So the role of media, as I said, maybe echoes and is bound up with the trajectory of veganism, where it kind of helps to make being vegan, engaging in vegan practice a lot easier, but it also potentially is focused on maximising food choices within existing systems rather than reflecting critically on those systems. So the fact now, for instance, that you can kind of get, you can go onto Uber Eats and get a load of vegan options, or you can get apps where you go around the supermarket and scan products in, obviously is important in making things kind of more accessible, normalising vegan practice, potentially making things less elitist. All of this kind of grave media, as Fuller and Goffey puts it, that you don't really think about, like ordering systems and apps, etc., but are really kind of important in sustaining everyday food practice. They make it more convenient, but they also perhaps just add veganism as a kind of another menu choice among others. And some of the work I kind of did already has pointed to some of the tensions that people felt around that kind of intersection of particular forms of, I suppose, digital infrastructures and the popularization of veganism that was occurring. So in the interviews I did, I asked everyone a direct question about digital media, but it was also an underlying theme. People raised it across all the questions. And many of the things they said kind of fed into existing work I'd done on the relationship between food and media infrastructures. So digital infrastructures, apps, platforms, kind of bound up with the newfound ease of veganism, but also kind of maybe exacerbated some of the tensions associated with its popularization. So in general terms, the way people talked about digital media was in quite a kind of broad way. Many people talked about the importance of social media platforms in sustaining and creating community, making things more convenient. You know, Danny here, the kind of quote in the middle, has this really nice example saying things are so more specific now. You can just say like, what's the best waffle or pancake in Manchester? And you can kind of get this list on a map of everything around you. It just means it's easy to be vegan, but also to be part of a community. Other people kind of noticed advantages in terms of visibility, in terms of breaking down of gatekeeping roles and making kind of narratives much more visible. People talked about normalization, how platforms like Instagram kind of created connections between vegans by allowing people to sort of share hashtags, food images, and so on. But it's this kind of last line that I found kind of interesting and perhaps spoke to some of the broader themes raised by interviewees about the relationship between popularity, easiness, and a sense of depoliticization. So as Thomas says here, there's this kind of risk of thinking, oh, I've joined a Facebook group now, and that exhausts the possibilities of my activism. Others talked about antagonism that can be generated. So Ali here, for example, runs a group for vegans of colour and says that actually that attracts antagonism online in a way that is obviously kind of undermines more kind of complicated political articulations of issues. And this quote kind of by Benny, and I think this is quite evocative, says, I think I kind of thought of veganism as a small glass of water that was solid, but it had volume and substance to it. And now it's become a huge pool that's growing exponentially at the edges, but it's very, very thin. And he didn't necessarily think about that as a bad thing necessarily. He actually thought about it as something that was more difficult to combat than this kind of small pool of water. But it's just still interesting to note those shifting dynamics. What this kind of spoke to in a sort of slightly interesting way was this sense of pervading ambivalence here. So kind of people were talking about there's so much debate and antagonism surrounding vegan online. It's like a Monty Python thing of kind of deciding whether you're in Vegans UK or UK veganism. There were all these tensions. And then this is the kind of point really that draws things together. And sorry, I realised because of the technical issues, I'm going to be slightly 5 minutes over than I'd hoped, but you know. So he says here, the dilemma comes when people start saying, hey, McDonald's have got a vegan burger. When you try to, the dilemma and concern is that when you try to raise this on vegan forums and say, McDonald's though, there's a danger of getting shouted down by all the new supposedly ethical, oh yes, we've been vegan for 10 minutes and know about it. Why are you banging on about McDonald's when McDonald's are so great for doing vegan burgers? And so there's this kind of, I suppose, sense here of this imagined audience on online forums of these kind of new vegans who are going to kind of shout down people who are trying to sort of situate veganism as a practice that should intersect with labour issues, that veganism is not just about animal ethics, it should also consider environmental factors and like labour concerns, and maybe not just say just because something's got a kind of vegan food product, it should be uncritically celebrated. But obviously, as somebody pointed out in a previous talk, this could be read as an incredibly kind of elitist argument, kind of making fun of young people, for example, for kind of enjoying their vegan burgers. And I think this is a site of tension across everything that needs to be contextualized a little. McLibel came up time and time again in the interviews, for anyone who doesn't know about it, it's still, I think, the longest running trial in the UK that occurred when McDonald's sued activists for writing a pamphlet critical about the corporation. There's a lot of fundraising that went on to support the case, perhaps most visibly via the McSpotlight website, which was actually launched before McDonald's had a website of their own and was seen as this really important activist initiative at the time, where it was kind of part of a very celebratory discussion of how the internet could be used to sort of support radical anti-capitalist ends, which is obviously a narrative that's shifted a lot more recently. So the website was accessed more than 1 million times in its first month, and this is from McSpotlight, so I'm not quite sure how accurate the statistic is. But why I wanted to draw attention to it is that sites like McSpotlight speak to a much longer history of participatory media use by anti-capitalist, animal and environmental activists that people kind of almost started to hint at and draw attention to in some of the interviews as a kind of contrast with sort of how media works today and also how veganism works today. So Graham, for instance, talks about the rise of social media, specifically in terms of surveillance capitalism, in the same way that kind of DIY punk has been rendered difficult by the rise of platforms such as Spotify. Any form of kind of radical activism has been sanitized or depoliticized, he suggests, because everything's filtered through surveillance capitalism. So you have to sort of frame your narratives in a way that's kind of quite particular to certain platforms. And this is where things really kind of intersected for me. Just as people in their interviews talked about how different it is today from when veganism was hard, and that's a quote from Ali, who's been vegan 12 years. Many people also talked about using media to promote veganism when it was hard. Danny here talks about the way you had to use the internet, emails, phone calls. Other people like Scotty talk about standing outside and holding flyers. And Sol here even talks about, typewriters, telephones, airmail. And there's this kind of constant contrast between when it was difficult with the easiness of today. And what I think this potentially could speak to are these kind of shifts from this very antagonistic relationship with mainstream media, with mainstream food, corporate food, I suppose, and how these things have kind of started to converge as they've both become more popular. You can now order McPlant burgers on Deliveroo rather than reading critically about McDonald's and McSpotlight. But what are the kind of stakes of these shifts? I think if we go back to kind of some classic work in feminist science studies, such as Susan Lee Starr, it's this kind of point about the way that infrastructures organise worlds, and that failure to kind of fit with the existing arrangements, as veganism kind of used to when it was impossible to eat anywhere, or kind of created space to ask whether things could be otherwise, potentially whether kind of food systems could be organised differently. And that's why it was kind of had this role in various forms of experimental prefigurative politics in protest camps. There's a risk of these narratives, though, of creating a hierarchy of veganisms, or indeed a hierarchy of any form of lifestyle activism, where those considered most kind of activist are at the top. And again, I'd like to thank Norman Riley, who's a PhD student at Essex, for sort of drawing attention to this point. And I think this was something that really came through and was recognised by people I interviewed. They were quite worried about seeming elitist and wanted to kind of balance criticism of food systems and their inequities, while recognising that this itself could almost lend itself to a hierarchy of veganism that perpetuated an elitism. There's concern that these discussions are often shut down due to a kind of populist backlash against veganism. And the dynamics are today, when formerly marginal ethical practices become popularised, they often face a populist backlash. And this can sometimes get in the way of more complicated questions about inequalities surrounding lifestyle activism. So just to close, and I've rushed through that last slide because I know I'm way over, but I think popular veganism has sort of had this issue of being focused on maximising choice within existing food systems, which can mean it's sometimes in tension with sustainability narratives, as well as quite different from maybe some of its activist origins. and similar shifts have occurred within the media landscape. As these developments come together, the kind of question I keep asking is whether there's still space to ask more kind of critical questions about whether things could be otherwise as these processes of enrolment have occurred. Sorry, I went over. I think I got thrown by all the technical issues, but thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Eva, and for so serenely getting through those technical glitches. So that was a fascinating talk. Thank you so much. I'll kick off with just a couple of very basic, simple questions while others are getting their thoughts together. So one, I'm not a vegan myself, but I tried to, as best I can, to tend in that direction, partly just for, basic climate change reasons. Can I screen share? Yeah, I was just going to share a thing I have on screen. This data that shows what an extraordinary proportion of the planet is occupied by cattle, basically, and could be used much more efficiently for something else or just given over to wilderness. Is it for reasons of climate change and biodiversity that is driving this huge swing towards veganism, or are there other factors that I don't know about or that I haven't spotted? Another question is, I noticed this rise of, plant-based meat products, increasingly sophisticated. I wanted to ask you about that because technology has been one of the consistent themes of these sustainability politics seminars that we've been running. This is an example of, ultra high tech being used to sort of veganize the hamburger. Is there a kind of consensus vegan approbation or critique of these developments? I've noticed in the last year that actually some of the stock market prices of these companies have been diving. Their market expectations haven't been being fulfilled as they had anticipated. But anyway, that's a marginal point. So there are just a couple of questions to get things going.
I'll start with the second one. And I know Neil Stevens used to work here, and he's obviously better placed to talk about plant-based meat, I think. But Alex Sexton's also done a lot of work on the kind of remarkable Silicon Valley investment in plant-based meat. It was clearly this kind of quite interesting bubble that was there were just so many tech startups that really rose exponentially. And what I'd say is that it's quite divided in the sense, I think there's sort of typical responses to view it with suspicion, but there's been some interesting work from people like Jan Dutkowitz, who I think is based at Concordia at the moment, who takes a slightly more provocative position and argues that actually maybe there are these potentials in things that most people would write off as deeply problematic because of their implication in venture capital, etc. So I wouldn't say that I wouldn't say there's a consensus. I think there's a lot of really heated debate about it, essentially. I think there's just quite a lot of other people doing interesting work about the tensions surrounding it. In terms of what's driving veganism, I'd say that's an kind of empirical question so I can only really speak to my sense of it rather than, I think there's probably more of an emphasis on reduction rather than, like Carol Morris has done quite a lot of work on sort of meat-free Mondays and initiatives such as that are about reduction. I think there's a kind of, I think the new climate movements have drawn a lot of visibility to veganism and have popularized narratives about links between meat reduction and dairy reduction and sustainability. And I've done a lot of work in kind of popularizing those narratives. But I think realistically, it's exploded so much it's impossible to attribute that explosion to kind of environmental politics. I think there's a lot of kind of greenwashing happening. If we look at the kind of branding that's going on by many corporations, it just seems like it's a kind of quite a fashionable hook at the moment. There's a kind of health discourse around it as well, particularly with certain forms of elite athleticism that's been pushed. So I think there are kind of multiple narratives about it, but I think there's, in terms of its fashionability, I think environmentalism is like one strand. I wouldn't say it's the sole driver or even necessarily the most popular one, but it is used and appropriated by more commercial narratives, etc. as well. So
thank you. So James is next, and then Anne, and then Eleanor.
Okay, thank you, and thanks for the paper. I mean, I suppose it's a similar question in a way to the one that Gareth was asking. I mean, I was thinking as you were talking about it in relation to capitalism, and how capitalism kind of always has this way of extending its tendrils to extract value from anything that it can at different points. And I mean, I've looked at it in some of my own work in relation to disability, about how disabled people themselves have kind of remarketed in a way as consumers, and there being a whole range of different products and services that can be marketed specifically to them to extract this extra value out of them, while at the same time doing something similar to greenwashing, and you make yourself a good company by doing these things, or having disability access and so on. And I suppose I was wondering in relation to veganism, what it was that perhaps happened 4 or 5 years ago to suddenly make it something out of which this extra value could be extracted that perhaps wasn't there before. I mean, I don't know if that's a question you can answer, but it feels as if there's something. I mean, particularly in the way that you've constructed it, is almost you've had this activism kind of veganism that had been going on for 100 years or whatever, and suddenly there has been this impetus or this change that's been relatively recent, if that makes sense.
Yeah, again, I think it's more work, because there's loads of speculative reasons why people have put forward that's happened. A lot of people do attribute it to the rise in digital media and the rise of certain forms of campaigning that have made issues more visible. The rise of kind of the streaming of quite high profile documentaries that people have shared and things like that. So people have attributed it to those types of developments. But again, I think that's a relatively small proportion of vegan kind of people interested in animal ethics. I wouldn't think is necessarily the dominant strand today. I think there are probably kind of multiple reasons. But one thing I've noted in particular is that kind of health narrative. So the kind of anecdotal example I gave was I was sat around a table a while back with a lot of people who played American football, who a few years ago had all been eating kind of meat, I suppose, or been eating, and everybody said, "Oh, I'm mostly plant-based now," and that was in a kind of relatively short period of time, and it was because of a sort of proliferation. When you kind of asked them why, it was because of a kind of proliferation of texts that had emphasized meat reduction and linked that to sort of elite athleticism in that context. But I think there's probably multiple things going on at the same time. I think there is a growing climate narrative, but I think there's also this kind of health narrative. So again, it's a sort of layering of different things that often intersect with one another. But I think some more empirical work needs to be done, really, because there are lots of conflicting interpretations at the moment, I think.
Yes, thank you.
Anne is next.
Thank you. Thank you for your paper. I really enjoyed it. And it chimed with all kinds of things. I haven't read your book, but I've got it on order.
Oh,
so you'll get 0.1 of a penny, I think, Bloomsbury Players. If I can continue with this question, which I think you posed as, what's driving veganism? I entirely agree with you. It remains an open empirical question. And I thought the way you listed the possible, as you called it, multiple layers was very interesting. But I think it also, and you've taken it from sort of what's publicly available to the general public. I really try and avoid using the word consumer unless I'm sort of being an economist, and I'm mostly not. And so there's the kinds of things that you and I can pick up around us. But I think you need also to think about the industry, the producers, the advertising people, and above all, the market researchers. If you watch and keep an eye on the food industry trade press, and you can sign up to free newsletters from 4 or 5 different, some American, some UK, online journals. If you want, please email me, and it's ann.murcott@nottingham.ac.uk, and I can give you the URLs. Because if you keep an eye on them, and I really can't keep an eye on all of them in detail, but I just sort of flick through them quickly before I have to delete them because my inbox is overflowing. But you need to watch those, because all the things you've been talking about are available to and picked up by the market researchers. And the market researchers are constantly feeding one or other aspect of the food industry with updated consumer trends. Now, their consumer, if you watch them, and every now and then you can download a report if you're prepared to put up with being bombarded with, why haven't you bought our products, the kinds of messages. Because what the industry always does is look to market research and commission market research amongst the public. They want to get ahead of what they call trends. But let's forget that that there is also something niftily described by, I'm sure, many people, but also Sidney Mintz in Sweetness and Power, as supplier-induced demand. And the suppliers are very busy trying to stay ahead of the trends and providing what they call free choice to their consumers one way or another. And it's in just the same way that Tesco's or Sainsbury's will not only provide healthy meals or even meals you cook from scratch, but they also will, have on.
I'm so sorry about this. Zoom has been perfectly serviceable and smoothly running for all these meetings up until now, but it's in a bit of a mood today. Let's I'm hoping that Anne will rejoin us. In the meantime, I think it's probably best if Eleanor asks her question and then Anne can rejoin, rather than asking you, Eva, to respond to Anne when she's not here. I trust she'll rejoin us.
I've got a response, but
okay, Eleanor.
Thanks. Yeah. Well, I feel like my contributions aren't going to be as interesting or useful. So one thing that I was thinking about was in terms of like the rise in popularity in veganism in the last 5 years, is the documentaries, which I haven't seen any of. So for interpreting my comments, I've been vegan for about, I think it's my 13th year this year. So I'm probably amongst the generation of people that you're interviewing. But because I haven't seen any of these documentaries, I'm like, I don't really know what the content of them are. And I'm thinking like Cowspiracy, I think one of them is. But I know that lots of younger vegans cite these as being like, the reason why they're vegan. So I wondered if you had any thoughts about that as a possible kind of motivator.
I think Cowspiracy is like, well, when we were, I can remember talking about this with a few friends a few years ago when things first started to become popular. And I was like, why is everyone talking about veganism all of a sudden? And they were like, Cowspiracy is on Netflix. So it's again, not just the documentary, but the ease of accessing it, the fact that it sort of trended on Netflix or it was pushed on Netflix. And I think that was probably one factor. And then the success of that, I think there were then other documentaries kind of piggybacking off it a little bit as well. So yeah, I totally agree that that's a factor. But I also agree with kind of Anne in terms of the marketing push as well. So one of the things I talk about a bit in the book, not as much as I think I would have liked. Earthlings. Yeah, Earthlings I think is really influential as well, just seeing the comment from Zoe there. So the marketing visions of it are so interesting because they sort of strip it of that context. So you've got these really interesting parallel things happening where you've got Earthlings and Cowspiracy being really widely available. And then Sainsbury's, for example, are putting out these reports called The Future of Food, which are fascinating really, but they're sort of predicting a plant-based future, which are very, I suppose, yeah, it almost seems like a parody. Like I read it and I thought, is this like a parody narrative about what a marketer thinks about kind of veganism or plant-based food? And so, yeah, I find it really fascinating that you've got these two strands happening at the same time, where this is very politicized ethical engagement with veganism for environmental reasons. At the same time as you've got Sainsbury's saying plant-based diet, great for business sort of thing. So, yeah, it's really interesting. Thank you.
I don't want to assume that I can ask a second question. Do you want to
go ahead,
cycle through other people first?
No, go and ask a second one, and we've only got Josh next after
only. So
I mean, only one person in that sense. Quantitative, not qualitative.
Okay, I won't take it personally, Gareth.
The other thing I was thinking of, based on the other comments as well, was that people, I mean, obviously our motivations are often not actually something that we know about individually, which is obviously a slightly different question to the kind of sociological, like demographic shifts. But something that's become apparent over the last 5 years or so with the rise in sort of vegan items on menus is that lots of people don't actually know. They know what veganism is in this kind of marketing sense of like things having a V on them, but if you go to a restaurant and say that you're vegan, you'll often be asked, if you want gluten-free, or if you ask for gluten-free, you'll be told, oh, that doesn't have eggs in it, which I think highlights something probably to do with what Anne was talking about, which was, in terms of like, we've been told we have to be concerned about these health things, but we don't actually know the nutrition science. We don't know what ingredients are or how processes change them. Yeah,
I think absolutely. And the sort of report from Sainsbury's that I was talking about. Oh, sorry, Anne, this is kind of partly in response to your question as well. But I was saying one of the things that I didn't engage with it as much as I'd like, but I did. One of the things I was fascinated with this report from Sainsbury's that was predicting food trends and talking about it was sort of predicting that plant-based diets were going to be like 50% of people were going to be on plant-based diets. But there's this really nice vignette at the beginning where it's kind of predicting a future meal where there were all these kind of participants, and it was like, Jane is gluten-free, and I don't know, Tom, and it's kind of got all these candidates. So it was very much being narrated in that way, where there were these kind of dietary options, but plant-based will kind of cater for everybody. So it's a good thing to invest in because it's this kind of umbrella approach that other options can kind of slot into easily. So that's how it was narrated in that context, which I thought really does map onto that kind of gluten-free, vegan, these different options that very much don't engage with the kind of, that strand of activist animal ethics that you're talking about, that's also coexisting at the same time and being a kind of driver in those documentaries like Cowspiracy. Yeah.
Sorry, I beg your pardon. For some reason, Zoom suddenly just disappeared and I had to sign in again.
So sorry,
missed,
Zoom has been playing up today.
it's very weird, isn't it?
Yeah.
Apologies.
Welcome back. Very glad that you're back. So in the intervening time, Eleanor asked a question and
I'm sorry.
Eva was responding to hers, but also partly to yours. So maybe, but you're definitely you're up now. If you could resume your question, that would be best. And then after Eva responds, then we can move on to Josh. Sorry, Anne.
Oh, you're talking to me?
Yes, I was talking to you. I'm sorry.
You wanted to know what my question was?
Well, I was just inviting you, if you like, to resume your question and finish.
Oh, I see. No, yeah. I was simply going to ask Eva, you referred to something of Sainsbury's, and of course I was offline, so I didn't catch what it was. I wondered if you could let me know in the chat or something.
Yeah, sure, I can email. I'll drop you an email anyway, because for Cowspiracy, I'd applied for funding to do a project which was more along the lines of doing work with producers, just kind of asking about these types of questions. It was more kind of and I didn't get it. but I totally agree that I think in the book I have focused, because I was focused on interviewing people and looking at kind of popular cultural narratives really. I didn't, there were a few kind of reports that I looked at, but not in terms of the depth that you were talking about, and I think that's really important in order to get a much more coherent.
Let's correspond by email. I'll shut up. Although I can't mute myself without disappearing, so I think I shall have to just stay very quiet but unmuted.
Thanks, and sorry about that.
Your fault, Gareth.
Sorry, did you ask me to ask?
Yes.
Yes, sorry. Hi, sorry that I missed the beginning, just chaos day. But yeah, so I managed to join just at the point where you're talking about infrastructure, which is, you know, it is a conversation that we maybe had a little bit before. But I guess what always strikes me when you get to that part of the discussions that you're involved in is this sense of almost a kind of tragedy in a way, in that at the very moment like the veganism becomes popular, it also seems to lose some of its kind of critical purchase. And part of the reason of that is the fact that you move away from DIY infrastructures, as you mentioned, to these kind of global grey media kind of infrastructuring apps, I guess. And I guess without wanting to position you in a way that you might be uncomfortable with, but as someone who's involved in or has been involved in vegan activism and vegan politics, I guess I would be interested in what the sense is, or what your sense is in terms of that tension, and whether that moment has been lost in terms of infrastructure and DIY infrastructure to capital, or there is ways of negotiating or working with that problem, and whether there is perhaps a sense of optimism that we might find somewhere in all of that, I guess.
One of the things that, in terms of optimism, one of the things I thought was kind of I don't think it really worked, but some people tried to make an app that was vegan, but also that was just catered for vegan food, but also took into account Labour politics. Mm-hmm. And I think it's called like Get Me Vegan Grub or something like that. But I don't think it ever really took off. And I was looking at their kind of marketing, or I was looking at their kind of social media presence recently, and it was kind of much more akin, yes, it was on Facebook, but it was all these kind of anti-McDonald's narratives saying like, look at these histories, we're not going to be stocking the McPlant burger, and it was kind of attaching to these very specific activist histories in a way that other things weren't. I mean, one thing that I think is important probably to think about is that these things often coexist with one another. It's really easy to create neat narratives, isn't it? To say that, oh, we've gone from this to this, or we've gone from kind of activist veganism to, but these things do totally coexist with one another. It's a bit, I always think of it in a sort of popular, in a kind of Stuart Hall type sense of different things competing for meaning and competing to kind of gain dominance as meanings. Sorry, Anne, I think.
I'm sorry, I put my hand up because if I touch anything here, I'll disappear again. Am I allowed another question?
Yes.
Thank you. And in fact, you've just, as it were, fed straight into my other question, which was you used the expression lifestyle activism. And there's two things I'd want to raise about it. One was to ask where it comes from, but the other, in relation to the point that Josh was just making, is that to, as it were, reduce veganism to lifestyle removes the politics. And that there's the old general point that all of us more or less have to struggle with, and that's a distinction in the old expression between emic and etic. I think that lifestyle has to be regarded as an emic expression. I think it is very unhelpful for anthropologists and sociologists to treat it as a concept in their armament, you know, in their conceptual armamentarium. Is that the right word? And that, you know, lifestyle means so many different things that I don't think it helps. And if underneath our anthropology, we're trying to say, have a political message as well, then to talk about lifestyle activism actually, I think, risks removing the politics that Josh was talking about, if I understood you correctly, Josh, because the word politics has disappeared and it's under something like lifestyle, which the epidemiologists certainly regard as a matter of daily behavior, which the individual, not the collective, the individual has control over. I mean, I disagree with them, but that's a separate point. So I just wondered what led you to use this expression?
So that isn't my expression. It's from work in social movement studies, which is kind of defends politics. That it's kind of saying, you're right, that needs a lot of unpacking actually, so that it doesn't have the negative valence. So it's a term that's used in the context of a few articles, particularly by like Ross Hainflair, which is kind of saying that in social movement studies, the term lifestyle is often used in a really derogatory way, as you say, to mean something individualistic, single issue, or kind of it's sort of associated with a kind of neoliberal, I suppose, form of politics that just doesn't really focus on structure. And the argument put forward there is saying, well, actually, it's important to move beyond that derogatory framing and think about the political potentials that are in things that are written off as just lifestyle politics.
Right, but I'm not sure that it helps to continue using the word lifestyle.
I suppose I just wonder if it's necessary to provide a lot of that context, or, you know, before using it. But you're right, it can then be interpreted as this very kind of derisory, really, way of framing things.
I'm continually reminded of the market researchers, and I've spent quite a bit of time sitting in the same room as them. And it is marvelous listening to them insofar as the casual way in which they co-opt any and every expression and invent a load of their own. You know, it is fascinating, and if only we could get access to study them much better, because getting access into the production side is so much harder. But I think that, you know, it behoves us all to try a lot harder than we have, although I agree it's very difficult, and I can't talk because I haven't done it in any systematic fashion.
I think, so I would still defend, just because I think you're right, it's something that's been appropriated and been obviously used in market rhetoric, and it has that association. But I do feel that it's kind of, I feel almost potentially because of that, because it's helpful to, the point of the term in some ways was sort of taking something that has been talked about in such a derogatory way and saying, look, we need to rethink this. We need to kind of rethink the lifestyle as something political. And I think there's the arguments that were made in relation to that, for me, were quite important. But whether I think you're right that maybe that hasn't come across, certainly in terms of how I was framing it.
Right. I mean, presumably you're sort of, bringing up to date that elderly feminist expression, the personal is the political, because all of us I was going to say round this table, whatever we're going to call this screen, will recognize that. But I think that if we want to make any kind of a difference, and I take it that these seminars, I think it's very hard to have a series of seminars on sustainability, which doesn't at its core, at the base, say, we approve of sustainability and we don't approve of unsustainability. So, we're already positioned in one direction vis-a-vis sustainability. But I think that then, I suppose I'm simply repeating the point that you've nicely made of we need to unpack this and we need to think so hard about what we're saying and the words we're using to say it.
So one of my colleagues, so I did a departmental talk yesterday where I was trying to work through some stuff in a bit of a more vague way. This is trying to be a bit more polished. I'm not sure if it was or not. And one of the comments that she was asking about was like the term popular, because again, that's something that's often used in a sort of slightly derogatory way. And she was like, what's wrong with something being popular? And I was kind of like, well, I'm not saying it's popular, but again, it's a term that's got these quite complicated meanings and histories associated with it that requires quite a lot of unpacking. And you can potentially do that in a book or even an article, but then I don't know, it's so easy then to decontextualize them. But popular lifestyle.
I mean, it's almost as if we need to get to the stage where, we each of us work on it, problematize it like crazy, try and unpack it, and then come up with a shorthand way of getting through all the hard work we've put into problematizing it, in order to be able to quickly, as a shorthand, to say, no, we're not talking about lifestyle activism, we're talking about whatever it is we've come to. And, so we're having to invent terminology ourselves to bypass the overtones that we're trying to escape. No doubt that too will get popularized, but sorry, it's not the word I actually meant. It also will go mainstream and we have to do it all over again. But I think that's one of the burdens we all have to bear.
Right, I think we're beginning to come to a close. But if there are other questions, feel very welcome, particularly if Will or Zoe want to chip anything in, you'd be welcome to, of course. I was wondering also about Cowspiracy. I recall that it was widely ridiculed and, savagely critiqued because it was, for quite justifiable reasons. And yet, despite its flimsy basis, it really had a powerful effect in turning many people towards veganism. But,
that's why we need to take those texts seriously, isn't it? Rather than, I think it's really easy. You see it loads with like Blue Planet again, which is a text that I think rightfully there are lots of critical things that can be said about it. But you think about how remarkable it is that suddenly everyone's talking about plastic. Do you know what I mean? Something that it just wasn't on a lot of people's radar. And I think there's so many holes you can pick in the way that Blue Planet presented that issue and of the kind of actions that were generated as a response to that. But that doesn't mean it shouldn't be taken seriously as a kind of political text. And I think sometimes these things are dismissed in particular ways that can make it difficult getting at some of the contradictions in a text and the work that they're doing potentially.
Thanks. So we've time for one final question from Eleanor. And if for those of you who aren't watching the chat, there's a very interesting discussion involving Josh and going on there as well. I would, So Eleanor.
Yeah, thanks. I just want to say, because I forgot to before, that I really enjoyed hearing about veganism in this context, because it's been something that's quite disconnected from my academic work, even though I'm technically somewhat of an ethicist. And that's what I actually wanted to ask a question about. So one of the things that the quotes that you had from your interviewees made me think about, and I sort of mentioned this in passing when I was talking to you before, which was the sort of idea of generational differences. So I was wondering about the ages of the people, because I think you were saying that the number in brackets wasn't their age, it was number of years that they'd been vegan, right? And so if it was all 10 plus years, then presumably that indicates that they were at least over a certain age.
Yes.
And I was just wondering, you know, what your thoughts were about, you know, does veganism actually mean something different to younger people? Does it actually mean plant-based products or potentially services, I suppose?
That was the real source of anxiety, I think, that people had. Again, I think you need to probably speak to new vegans in a more sustained way to actually answer that. But the real anxiety was there was so much concern about the use of plant-based, and that the politics of that, whereas veganism had a very kind of specific political history as a movement, and there was I suppose real worry about the kind of deliberate, and companies like Burger King were sort of deliberately using the slippage in their defense. So like Burger King brought this burger out called like the Rebel Whopper that was branded, it was in Veganuary, and it was branded as a plant-based burger. And then there was a kind of case against them by the Advertising Standards Agency because it wasn't actually vegan. So I think it got mayonnaise on it or something like that, and it was cooked. And their kind of rationale, the kind of defense that was given, was that it was for a flexitarian diet, and it's sort of in response, I think lifestyle was used, but it's in response to people taking a kind of flexitarian lifestyle, and it wasn't targeted at vegans. And they were found that this was found to be a kind of spurious defense, because it's like, well, you did release it in Veganuary and it did have like all this branding, but it was interesting that the kind of slippage between kind of vegan, flexitarianism and plant-based was being used quite strategically in that context. And many people were sort of pointing to examples like this and sort of saying, this is what makes it, you know, there was a concern saying, look, we realise if we're too rigid about what veganism means and try to impose like our understanding of it, then it's potentially exclusionary to kind of new people who are becoming vegan. But if you don't, then it leads itself to these kind of ridiculous scenarios where you get companies kind of trying to redefine it in ways that fit particular marketing niches and just are totally removed from, purposefully almost removed from a specific type of ethics that has historically been associated with it. And yeah, I think the youngest person was I think it actually in their sort of mid-20s was the youngest person, and everybody else, you know, certainly people who had been vegan kind of 30-40 years were obviously kind of were older. And I found that kind of interesting really in terms of the reflections looking back at how activism had changed. There was one quote, I don't know if you saw, but it said something like, oh, it used to be just like 3 or 4 of us ringing around deciding what the vegan movement was going to be in the UK, and now it's and obviously that was an exaggeration, that was a joke, but yeah, I think there is a kind of positivity and optimism about no longer feeling about that widespread popularity, but also concern about what is, if it becomes something that's so porous and so flexible that it can then be kind of appropriated in these ways by companies. What does that do? And I think that was the kind of core tension that people were wrestling with.
Yeah, which I guess takes you back to thinking about, so like, what does Cowspiracy say, or what does, you know, wherever this the sort of impetus or like information about a vegan ethics or a vegan politics comes from, because I guess the reason I was thinking in this way was because part of my own work is thinking about, in a very different context, how words that represent key kind of values or positions in a social movement, like how do they get passed down between generations within that movement, and sort of how change is negotiated in terms of defining, you know, who has the power to define what they mean. And obviously, as somebody who is a vegan, like I'm sort of looking at this from a very different point of view than how I sometimes look at the data that I work with in my own research. But I think it's very interesting to sort of feel that more personally, maybe in some sense.
Yeah, I mean, somebody I think used the term floating signifier and was kind of saying it almost becomes this, because I mean, veganism, it helps in that there is, certainly in the UK, there's a kind of UK Vegan Society definition that tends to get evoked, and people can kind of go back to this sort of written account of what veganism is. But even that, because it says as practical and possible, that can become a line of contestation, because there's obviously a sort of individualistic understanding of what's practical and possible, which could be like, oh, it's not practical for me to, I don't know, to eat. It's not practical at this moment in time for me to do X, Y, Z, or for me to be vegan. So it can be framed as an individual level of flexibility, potentially, if it's appropriate or pushed in certain ways strategically. But it can also mean something structural, and it was originally intended to be sort of this, I suppose, pointing out that the way food systems are organised means that there's no possible way of being vegan because of the way that society is organised. You know, sort of animal manure is used on products. These are used to grow vegetables. You know, so it was pointing out that the way that things are organised make things possible in order to kind of act as a lever for thinking about how things could be organized differently. But I can see how that could easily be reinterpreted as a more individualistic sense. And I think these struggles over meaning, I've kind of framed the final chapter of my book as really thinking about a point where all these meanings are proliferating around a term that's got a particular history, and different parties have maybe got a vested interest in encouraging or promoting certain meanings and not others. I can see that kind of idea of the intergenerational work of activists and passing down their meanings seems particular important for the kind of ballast against wider changes in some ways.
Because maybe some of the animosity potentially about, like that you pointed out, when some of the older or more years vegan, I don't know, we call veteran vegans, might be, you know, to do with maybe feeling like they've been bypassed, that people aren't going to them in the way that maybe they might have done in the past because they've got these Netflix documentaries or Facebook groups and whatever.
Yeah, somebody finished their interview with saying, I'm going to close with an analogy. It's like your favourite band's gone global and you kind of feel a little bit resentful that you spent all your money on gigs in the local pub and now everyone likes him and they're not quite as good as they used to be.
Thank you a lot.
All right, I think we need to close there. So thank you so much to Eva for sharing your ideas on veganism with you, for giving such a fantastic talk, which has sparked such a rich discussion as well. I also want to briefly thank Josh for alerting me to Eva's work in the first place, and to James for passing on this invitation to others, especially to Anne. The final seminar or webinar in this sustainability politics series, and by the way, I think sustainability is essentially a meaningless term. I'm sure you can see the point. The final seminar is on 27th of April, and it's Wim Carton from Lund University and possibly Andreas Malm with him as well, speaking on fossil capital and carbon removal. So thank you all, and thank you, Eva.
Thank you. And I really, really valued the discussion. So I just really thank you for that. It's really appreciated. And
an anti-thank you to the gremlins of Zoom. but we overcame them. Okay, bye for now.
Thank you, everyone.